My son, Julian, slid the leather-bound folder across the polished oak of my dining table. The sound was quiet, but it echoed in the silence of the house like a gunshot. My daughter, Sophia, stood behind him, her arms crossed, a perfect portrait of detached concern. It had only been 6 weeks since we buried their father, and this was the first time they had come to the house together. Not for comfort, not for remembrance, but for an ambush. "Mom," Julian began, his voice smooth and practiced, the one he used for hostile negotiations. "We need to talk about the future. Your future." He tapped the folder. "We've had some professionals evaluate the situation. They agree with us. We think it's time we took over the management of your assets." I stared at him, my heart beginning a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. "My assets? You mean the garden?" "The garden is the primary asset, yes," Sophia chimed in, stepping forward. She placed a hand on my arm, but her touch was cold as glass. "It's a huge responsibility, Mom, too much for you to handle alone now. We've drawn up some papers." Julian opened the folder. My eyes caught the words at the top of the first page, typed in stark black ink. "Petition to establish conservatorship," and just below it, the legal justification. "On grounds of diminished mental capacity and inability to manage financial affairs. Legally incompetent." The breath left my body in a silent rush. They weren't just suggesting they help. They were staging a coup. They were trying to declare their own mother mentally unfit to steal the legacy she had built with their father, brick by brick, seed by seed, for 45 years. "It's for your own good," Julian said softly, his eyes avoiding mine. "You'll be happier this way. No more stress," Sophia added, her smile never reaching her eyes. I felt a tremor start in my hands. The room, filled with the soft afternoon light, filtering through the ferns in the window, suddenly felt like a cage. I looked from my son's handsome, determined face to my daughter's perfectly composed expression. I didn't see my children. I saw strangers. Vultures, circling what they thought was a dying animal. Without a word, I stood up. The chair scraped against the floor, the sound sharp and violent. I walked out of the room, leaving them with their leather-bound betrayal on the table. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not in front of them. I walked through the quiet house, my hand trailing along the wall, until I reached my husband's study. I closed the door, leaned against it, and finally let out the breath I was holding. My body shook, not with grief, but with a cold, clarifying rage. 30 seconds later, I picked up the phone. I dialed a number I hadn't called in years, a number I prayed I would never have to. When a calm, familiar voice answered, I didn't hesitate. "Marcus," I said, my own voice steady and clear, "it's time." They did it. My mind reeled back, just 6 weeks earlier, to the sterile scent of the hospital. I was holding my husband Matteo's hand. His hands, which had sketched 1,000 blueprints for our garden and planted a forest of dreams, were now so still, so fragile in mine. The heart monitor beeped a slow, failing rhythm beside us. "Has fading, Julian," I had whispered into the phone, my throat tight. "Please, just come." A pause on the other end, the sound of keyboard clicks. "I can't, Mom. I'm in the middle of closing a huge deal. It's the most important week of my career. I'll try to get there this weekend." But we didn't have until the weekend. I called Sophia next. She was at a conference in Chicago. "Oh, Mom, I'm so sorry," she'd said, her voice distant. "I'm about to go on stage. I'll call you right after. Send him my love." He didn't need their love sent through a text message. He needed his children. He needed them to be there, to hold his other hand, to say goodbye. But they were busy with deals and conferences, busy building their own futures on the foundation he had given them. They did eventually show up, 2 days later, for a fleeting 15-minute visit. They stood awkwardly by his bedside, checking their phones every few moments. Julian talked about the stock market. Sophia mentioned a new marketing campaign. They spoke in low, respectful tones, as if they were visiting a business associate, not the father who taught them how to ride their bikes in the very garden they now saw as a financial asset. "Dad would want us to be strong," Julian said, patting my shoulder as they left. "He wouldn't want us to neglect our careers because of this." I sat there, long after they had gone, holding Matteo's cooling hand. He squeezed my fingers one last time, a flicker of his old strength. He looked at me, his eyes full of a lifetime of love and a sorrow I was only just beginning to understand. "Protect our garden, Estella," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Protect our soul." He was gone before the sun rose the next morning. The funeral was a blur of black suits, sympathetic murmurs, and the heavy scent of lilies. I handled everything alone. I chose his casket, wrote his eulogy, and greeted the hundreds of people who came to pay their respects. And I chose the flowers myself. I walked through our garden at dawn, the dew cold on my ankles, and snipped the whitest roses, the ones Matteo called Estella's stars, and the deep purple irises he'd cultivated from a single bulb he brought back from Spain. I arranged them myself, my hands moving with a purpose that defied the hollowness in my chest. Julian and Sophia stood beside me, playing the part of grieving children perfectly. They dabbed their eyes, accepted condolences with somber nods, and spoke eloquently about what a great man their father was. But I saw them. During the reception, I saw them slip away towards the edge of the great lawn, with a man in an expensive suit I didn't recognize. He held a tablet, swiping through images. I was too far away to hear everything, but a few words drifted towards me on the wind, sharp as shards of glass. Prime real estate, untapped potential, a seamless transition. My blood ran cold. They weren't mourning their father. They were surveying their inheritance. They were standing on the sacred ground where we had scattered his favorite dog's ashes, where Wed held their childhood birthday parties, where he had proposed to me under the old oak tree, and they were calculating its worth. Later that day, after the last of the guests had departed, leaving behind a mountain of uneaten food and empty platitudes, I walked alone to his freshly covered grave. The earth was dark and raw. I placed a single white rose on top. "I will protect our garden, Matteo," I whispered to the silence. "I will protect our soul, I promise." As if on cue, I heard footsteps behind me. It was Julian and Sophia. "Mom," Julian said, his voice soft again, "we did well today. Dad would have been proud." I didn't turn around. I couldn't look at them. "We think," Sophia added, "that we should have an important family meeting next week, to discuss the estate, to make sure everything is handled properly." The anger that had been simmering inside me began to harden. It was no longer a fluid, hot emotion. It was becoming something solid, something strong, something I could build with. I finally turned to face them, my expression unreadable. "Fine," I said. "Next week." And that led us here. To this moment, with their petition for my incompetence sitting on the dining table, a declaration of war disguised as an act of love. In Matteo's study, the scent of old books and dried lavender still lingered. It was my sanctuary. I walked over to his large mahogany desk, the one he had designed himself. My fingers traced the familiar grain of the wood before stopping at a small, almost invisible knot on the side. I pressed it. A hidden drawer, no bigger than a shoebox, clicked open. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a single, ornate brass key and a thick, sealed envelope. My name was written on the front in Matteo's familiar, elegant script. My hands trembled as I broke the wax seal. I knew what this was. It was his final contingency. The plan he had made for a day he hoped would never come. The letter was short. "My dearest Estella," it read. "If you are reading this, it means my greatest fear has come true. Our children have chosen spreadsheets over soul. They see our life's work not as a legacy, but as a ledger. Do not despair. I knew this might happen. I saw the hunger in their eyes years ago. I have made preparations. This key is for the safe box hidden behind the rooting shelves in the main greenhouse. Marcus knows the location. Give it to him. He has been my trusted friend for 30 years, and he knows my final wishes. Everything you need is in that box. Do not let them erase our story, my love. Fight for it. Fight for us." I folded the letter, clutching it to my chest. The tears I had held back finally came, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude, of love for the man who had known me and our children so completely, the man who was still protecting me, even from beyond the grave. The cold rage in my heart was now forged into a weapon. They thought I was a frail old woman, lost in her grief. They thought I was weak. They were about to find out how wrong they were. Julian and Sophia had started a war, but Matteo and I were going to finish it. The next morning, I found Marcus in the main greenhouse, the one we called the cathedral. It was a vast structure of glass and steel that Matteo had designed to feel like a living, breathing lung. Morning light streamed through the panes, illuminating the swirling mist from the humidifiers and making the giant ferns and exotic palms look like creatures from another world. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, blooming orchids, and life itself. Marcus was carefully tending to a new hybrid of hibiscus, his large, gentle hands moving with the precision of a surgeon. He'd been with us since he was a boy of 16, starting as a summer helper and growing into the most knowledgeable and passionate horticulturist I had ever known. He was more family than our own children had been. He looked up as I approached, his weathered face etched with a quiet sadness. He didn't know the details, but he knew the storm that was gathering. "Estella," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I was so sorry to hear about the meeting. Word traveled fast among the staff. They were my family now." "It was worse than you heard, Marcus," I said, my voice low. I held out the brass key. It looked small and almost insignificant in the palm of my hand. "Matteo left this for me. He said you would know what to do with it." Marcus's eyes widened slightly as he looked at the key. He wiped his hands on his trousers and took it from me with a reverence that made my throat tighten. He nodded slowly. "I do," he said. "He showed me, years ago. He told me it was the Guardian's key, and that I should only ever follow instructions from you about it." He led me to the back of the greenhouse, to a long wall of rooting shelves filled with hundreds of terracotta pots, each nurturing a new beginning. He counted 5 rows down and 10 pots in. He carefully lifted the pot, which held a small budding gardenia, and set it aside. Behind it, almost perfectly camouflaged against the aged wood, was a small keyhole. Marcus inserted the key and turned. There was a soft click, and a section of the shelving swung inward, revealing a dark, cool space behind it. It was a small, climate-controlled vault built right into the foundation of the greenhouse, and in the center of the vault sat a heavy, fireproof safe box. My heart pounded. Marcus dialed a combination that I had never known, and the heavy door swung open. Inside, there was no money, no jewelry. There was only a single, thick, legally bound document and a neat stack of 5 external hard drives, each labeled with a year. The document on top was the original, signed and notarized last will and testament of Matteo Romero. Not the simplified one our lawyers had filed. This was the real one, the complete one. I picked up the top hard drive, its cool metal surface, a stark contrast to the living warmth of the greenhouse. Matteo had always been fascinated by technology, always looking for ways to integrate it with the natural world. I finally understood what he had been doing in his study all those late nights. He hadn't been drafting blueprints. He had been building an ark to save our legacy from the flood he knew was coming. "Thank you, Marcus," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for protecting this." "I was protecting him," he replied simply. "And now, I'm protecting you." The day of the presentation arrived a week later. Julian and Sophia had spared no expense. A large, elegant white tent was erected on the great lawn, the very heart of our garden. Waiters in crisp uniforms served champagne and tiny, elaborate appetizers. A string quartet played softly in the corner. It was a scene of sophisticated triumph. They had invited dozens of people, city planners, journalists, and a group of stern-looking investors in dark suits, led by a man named Arthur Peterson. He was the CEO of Peterson Holdings, a titan of real estate known for his aggressive and wildly successful projects. He was the man my children were selling our soul to. I watched from the window of the main house as they mingled, Julian exuding a confident charm, and Sophia looking every bit the brilliant, powerful executive. They were in their element, a world of money and influence. I felt a pang of something that might have once been pride, but it was now twisted into a bitter knot of disgust. I waited. Marcus stood beside me, holding a slim laptop bag. We had spent the last week with Matteo's real lawyer, a woman of fierce intelligence and loyalty, going over everything. We knew what we had to do. The timing had to be perfect. Inside the tent, Julian took the stage. A massive screen behind him lit up with an artist's rendering of a sprawling, multi-story hotel where our rose garden now stood. A gleaming, 18-hole golf course replaced the wildflower meadow. The old oak tree, the one where Mateo had carved our initials inside a heart 50 years ago, was gone, replaced by a sparkling swimming pool complex. They called it the Romero Estates, a name that was a desecration in itself. The Romero Botanical Garden has been a beloved institution, Julian said into the microphone, his voice resonating with false sincerity. But in today's world, a legacy must evolve to survive. It must be maximized. My sister and I, as the sole inheritors and decision-makers for this estate, have a vision to transform this beautiful but underutilized land into a world-class luxury destination. Sophia took over, her presentation filled with charts and projections. She talked about revenue streams, investment returns, and property values. They never once mentioned the rare species of butterfly that only lived in that meadow. They never mentioned the collection of endangered orchids that Mateo had spent a decade cultivating. They spoke of the garden as if it were a vacant lot. Finally, the moment came. Mr. Peterson, looking thoroughly impressed, was invited to the stage. A small table was brought out, with a thick contract and an expensive pen. "My children have worked tirelessly on this," I heard Julian say, his voice full of pride as he looked at Mr. Peterson. "This project is not just business. It's about honoring our father's ambition." That was our cue. Marcus and I walked out of the house and across the lawn towards the tent. A few heads turned, whispers rippling through the crowd. Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second when he saw me, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. Sophia shot me a look that was pure ice. They thought I had come to make a scene, to beg, to cry. We walked straight to the front of the tent. I stepped onto the stage, taking the microphone from a stunned assistant. The string quartet trailed off into an awkward silence. Every eye in the tent was on me. "Good afternoon, everyone," I said, my voice calm and clear, amplified by the speakers. "My name is Estela Romero. I am Mateo Romero's wife, and I am sorry to interrupt, but this entire presentation, this entire deal, is based on a fundamental deception." A wave of gasps and murmurs swept through the audience. Julian's face turned a dangerous shade of red. "Mom, what are you doing?" he hissed, grabbing for my arm. I pulled it away. "Mr. Peterson," I said, looking directly at the CEO, whose face had hardened into a mask of cautious curiosity. "Before you sign that contract, you and your investors have the right to know who you are really dealing with." Marcus stepped forward. He opened the laptop bag, took out the computer, and calmly connected it to the projector. Julian's and Sophia's carefully crafted presentation vanished from the screen. In its place, an image appeared, my Mateo, sitting in his favorite armchair in his study. He looked tired, thinner than I remembered, but his eyes were clear and sharp. He looked directly into the camera. "If you are watching this," my husband's voice filled the silent tent, "it means my children, Julian and Sophia, have done exactly what I feared they would do." Sophia let out a small, strangled gasp. Julian stood frozen, his face a mess of confusion and dawning horror. "The Romero Botanical Garden is more than just land. It is more than an asset to be liquidated," Mateo continued, his voice resonating with a quiet power that commanded the attention of every person in that tent. "It is a living library of stories. It is my life's work, and it is my soul." I knew my children saw it differently. I knew they saw it as a dollar sign. That is why I added a specific, legally binding codicil to my true last will and testament. He looked down for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. "My children's inheritance of this garden," he said, looking back up, his gaze piercing, was conditional. It was contingent upon one thing: their proven commitment to preserving its integrity and purpose for a period of no less than 10 years following my death. Should they attempt to sell, subdivide, or fundamentally alter the character of this garden within that time frame, their claim to the inheritance becomes null and void. The silence in the tent was absolute. You could hear the distant buzz of a bee. In that event, Mateo's voice dropped, full of a father's sorrow. Ownership of the Romero Botanical Garden, in its entirety and with immediate effect, is to be transferred to the one person I trust to protect its soul above all else. He paused, and for a heartbreaking second, I saw the love and pain warring in his eyes. "That person is my beloved wife, Estela Romero." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Julian stumbled back a step, his face ashen. Sophia looked like she was going to be sick. Furthermore, Mateo's voice concluded, sealing their fate, to assist her in this duty. I have appointed the garden's longtime head curator and my trusted friend, Marcus Vance, as the sole trustee of the Romero Legacy Trust, which will oversee all operations. This is my final, unalterable wish. This is my legacy. The video ended. The screen went black. Arthur Peterson stood up. He didn't look at my children. He looked at me, a flicker of something that might have been respect in his cold eyes. He then turned to his team. "We're done here," he said, his voice clipped and final. "We do not do business with people who would defraud their own family." He and his investors turned and walked out of the tent without a single backward glance. The journalists, smelling a much bigger story than a real estate deal, began scribbling furiously in their notepads. The champagne glasses sat untouched. The contract lay unsigned on the table. The $50 million dream had evaporated into the warm afternoon air. I turned to face my children. They stood there, amidst the wreckage of their ambition, their faces masks of disbelief and raw, impotent rage. They had tried to paint me as a frail, incompetent old woman, but thanks to the love of my husband, I now owned their entire world. The aftermath was not a swift, clean victory, but a grinding, ugly war of attrition. Julian and Sophia, recovering from their initial shock, did exactly what their father had predicted. They fought. They hired a team of aggressive, high-priced lawyers and formally contested the video will, claiming I had manipulated a sick, dying man. They argued that Mateo was not of sound mind when he recorded it, and that Marcus and I had exerted undue influence. The legal battle dragged on for months. It was a draining, soul-crushing process. They dragged my name, Mateo's name, and our life's work through the mud. They painted me in court as a possessive wife who was jealous of her own children's success, a woman who couldn't bear to let go of the past. They portrayed Mateo as a sentimental old fool, out of touch with the modern world. Every day in that sterile courtroom felt like a new desecration of his memory. But Mateo had been meticulous. Our lawyer, a formidable woman named Clara, dismantled their case piece by piece. She presented the original, notarized documents that accompanied the video will, all signed in the presence of witnesses. She produced Mateo's medical records, which clearly showed that while his body was failing, his mind was as sharp as ever until the very end. Marcus gave a powerful, heartfelt testimony about his long conversations with Mateo, describing his passion, his foresight, and his deep-seated fear that his children would auction off his soul for a quick profit. The final nail in their coffin came from one of the other hard drives Mateo had left behind. It was a series of video diaries. In them, Mateo spoke candidly to the camera, documenting his growing disappointment with his children over the years. He spoke of their dismissive attitude towards the garden, their obsession with money, and their lack of empathy. The most damning entry was from a year before his death. "I tried to talk to Julian today," Mateo said to the camera, his face etched with sorrow. "I asked him what he would do with the garden one day. He laughed. He said he'd probably turn it into the most exclusive golf club on the West Coast. He thought he was joking. I knew he wasn't." When Clara played that clip in court, the room fell silent. Julian's face went pale. Sophia closed her eyes, finally defeated. The judge, a stern but fair woman, looked at my children with an expression of profound disapproval. The verdict was delivered on a cold, rainy afternoon. The judge upheld Mateo's final will in its entirety, ruling that it was a valid and legally binding testament. She dismissed my children's claims, and in a rare, personal remark, she called their actions a shameful display of greed and filial ingratitude. I had won. The garden was safe. It was mine, legally and completely. As I walked out of the courthouse, the rain washing the city clean, I didn't feel the elation I had expected. I just felt a deep, hollow emptiness. I had saved our legacy, but I had lost my children for good. The news of their public humiliation spread like wildfire. Their business associates, who valued reputation above all else, began to distance themselves. The $50 million deal with Peterson Holdings was dead, and with it, their credibility. Projects stalled, investors pulled out, and the financial empire they had built on the promise of their inheritance began to crumble. Sophia's marketing firm lost its biggest clients. Julian was asked to step down from the board of a prominent tech company. They had gambled everything on a future that was no longer theirs, and they had lost spectacularly. I would hear whispers about them from old family friends. They had to sell their lavish homes. Sophia had moved to a small apartment across the country. Julian was reportedly struggling with debt. They were pariahs in the world they had tried so hard to conquer. For a time, I felt a grim satisfaction. They had gotten what they deserved. But that feeling soon faded, leaving only a dull ache. The ache of a mother who, no matter what, could never truly rejoice in her children's ruin. I threw myself into the garden. It became my refuge, my purpose, my therapy. Working alongside Marcus and the staff, my hands in the rich soil, I felt closer to Matteo than ever before. We didn't just maintain the garden, we revived it. We opened new sections to the public, expanded our educational programs for local schools, and started a research initiative for endangered native plants. The garden thrived. It pulsed with more life and energy than it had in years. It was no longer just a beautiful place, it was a community, a living, breathing testament to Matteo's vision. I was beginning to feel a sense of peace I hadn't thought possible. I was healing. The garden was healing me. I had protected our soul, and in doing so, I had found my own again. Then, one morning, a letter arrived. It was a single, folded piece of paper in a cheap envelope, addressed in Julian's handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. It was the first time I had heard from either of them since the verdict. The letter was short, stripped of all his usual arrogance. He wrote that Sophia had left him to deal with the mess alone. He had lost everything: his business, his reputation, his home. He was sick, he wrote, with a chronic illness brought on by stress, and he couldn't afford his medical bills. He didn't ask for the full inheritance, just a small fraction, enough to get back on his feet. He ended the letter with 5 words that felt like a punch to the gut. "You're still my mother, right?" I sat at the kitchen table for hours, the letter lying in front of me. Every maternal instinct screamed at me to help him. He was my son, my boy who I had once held in my arms. But then I saw Matteo's tired eyes in the video will. I felt the cold sting of their betrayal in the dining room. I heard the words diminished mental capacity. I knew then that helping him would not fix him. It would only enable him. It would be a betrayal of Matteo, a betrayal of the promise I had made. Saving him would mean sacrificing the peace I had fought so hard to win. With a heavy heart, I walked to Matteo's study. I opened an old wooden box where I kept my most precious memories: a lock of Julian's baby hair, a crayon drawing from Sophia. I placed his letter inside, alongside the ghosts of the children they used to be. Then I closed the lid. It was an act of finality, an act of self-preservation. The next day, I met with Clara and Marcus. I didn't write a check to Julian. Instead, I signed a different set of papers. Papers that Marcus and I had been drafting for weeks. We were officially establishing the Matteo Romero Grant. It was a foundation, funded by a significant portion of the garden's annual profits, dedicated to providing full scholarships to promising, underprivileged students in the fields of botany and landscape architecture. We were taking the legacy that my children had tried to turn into cash and transforming it into opportunity, into education, into futures for young people who had the passion but not the privilege. We were planting new seeds. A few weeks later, we held a small ceremony in the garden to announce the grant's first recipients. As I stood on the lawn, watching the hopeful, brilliant faces of these young students, a profound sense of peace washed over me. The hollow space in my chest was filled, not with the ghosts of the past, but with the promise of the future. Julian was right. I was still his mother, but I was also the guardian of his father's soul, and my final act of love for my children was to let them go and to let this garden, our garden, become a gift to the world. I looked up at the old oak tree, its branches reaching towards the sky like open arms. The heart with our initials was still there, weathered by time but unbroken. I smiled, a real, genuine smile. "We did it, Matteo," I whispered to the wind. "Our story is safe."